Imagine living in a country where neither your money, nor your effort, nor even your intelligence and talent determine your fate. None of these are going to change your destiny. Only one thing matters: where you were born and what family you come from. And it's at that very moment that a system makes the decision whether you have the right to a normal life or if you just have to struggle to survive. This scenario isn't a fictional story. It's the reality for millions of people. In North Korea, India, and China, there are established systems in place that map out people's lives from the moment they're born until the very end of their days. In North Korea, the Songbun system, which was established after the Korean War between 1950 and 1953, classifies people based on their family background and level of political loyalty. It then ultimately dictates where you can live, the type of career you can have, and even the person you are allowed to marry. In India, the caste system still acts like an invisible wall. It is a wall that can cast a long shadow over marriage, employment opportunities, and even access to essential public resources like water. In China, the hukou system is like an invisible cage for more than 250 million people. Imagine a system that can severely limit and restrict access to education, healthcare, jobs, and even the possibility of urban migration. This last one is truly the most shocking of all. Once you really begin to understand how it works, your whole idea of justice will be challenged and called into question. So stay with me until the end of this video. Let's start with North Korea. North Korea emphasizes at almost every step it takes that it is a communist country. You can see this both in its national symbols, in its socialist realist art, in the heroic image of the leader who is presented as a symbol of loyalty to the ideology, and also in the strict and calculated restrictions it imposes on citizens' freedoms. We know that the foundation of a communist society is that it should be classless. So why are social classes so deep-rooted and entrenched in North Korea? This is exactly where the contradiction lies. These classes are neither natural nor spontaneous. They are completely artificial and have been created directly by the government. This system is called Songbun. In fact, Songbun is a hereditary system. That means your status is determined from the moment you are born. Your birth pretty much determines your job. Marriage truly only seems to make sense within your own social class. The place where you live, your food rations, your chances of receiving medical care, and even your educational future are all strictly predetermined. This system was designed by Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea in the mid-1950s, with a clear goal: to protect the regime. Every citizen is evaluated and assessed based on whether, in the eyes of the government authorities, they are deemed loyal and trustworthy or instead considered a potential threat. Accordingly, people are categorized and divided into three main classes. 1. The core or loyal class. These are people who are ideologically trustworthy and completely loyal to the regime. 2. The wavering class of individuals. People who are not considered outright enemies, but are also not seen as being fully trusted. 3. The enemy class, the lowest social class. This includes people whom the government considers hostile enemies or threats to itself. Of course, these classes themselves have many subgroups. For example, within the core class, these subgroups were included: revolutionaries close to Kim Il-sung, poor farmers, government officials, members of the Korean Workers' Party, military personnel, and people like that. In the wavering class, we can also see these groups: owners of small-scale workshops or factories, independent small business entrepreneurs, or even those individuals whom the government has labeled as lazy or corrupt. However, The enemy class specifically includes wealthy farmers, large landowners, and those individuals accused of supporting America or the regime's many enemies. But do you actually know what the truly scary part of this is? It's that this system is completely hereditary. This essentially means that if even one of your distant ancestors was accused of a serious political offense many decades ago, its impact still weighs very heavily on your life today. A single mistake, a false accusation, or even an unsuitable marriage can push the whole family down to a much lower social class. Promotion is almost impossible, but what about falling? Unfortunately, that happens very easily and frequently. Information about Songbun is confidential. Most people are aware it exists, but they don't know the specific factors that lead to a fall or a promotion. The government deliberately keeps this process shrouded in ambiguity. Most of what we know comes from human rights reports and accounts from defectors and those who have left, not from official transparency. Well, now you might think, that's easy. I'll just stay loyal to the system so my status is guaranteed. But you're dead wrong. It's not that simple either. Even absolute loyalty doesn't guarantee advancement. All it takes is to act against the government's wishes in any way. Then, in the eyes of the state, you become an unreliable element and get thrown into the enemy class. And the punishment system is collective too. If someone is deemed unreliable, their family pays the price as well. Even marriage between two different classes does not result in social promotion. On the contrary, the person from the higher class falls down to that lower social level, and their entire family is dragged down along with them. All this data is recorded in the government's database. From birth, nothing ever gets erased. There is no forgiveness. The passage of time doesn't change anything either. The Songbun system practically affects every aspect of life. Even in education, children from the highly core class can attend the best schools and have a much better chance at university. From the very beginning, the path to becoming an elite is open to them. But what about children from the lower classes? Weak schools with no real access to university and no bright future. It doesn't matter how smart they are. Their ceiling is strictly set in advance. When it comes to future jobs, I should tell you that it's the central government that decides your specific job. The Songbun system determines whether you get to sit behind a desk and have easy administrative or government positions, or waste your entire life doing the hardest, grueling physical labor. It might be hard for you to believe, but even food rations and the quality of medical care are affected by this system and are entirely dependent on a person's class. For example, during the Great Famine at the end of the 20th century, when the food distribution system collapsed, foreign aid arrived. But the government distributed the food in such a way that it first went to officials, the military, and the people of North Korea's capital, Pyongyang, while the so-called enemy class was more or less forgotten. About living in the capital as well. Living in the nation's capital is a special privilege. But people with a low Songbun status are basically not allowed to live in Pyongyang. This is because the capital serves as the regime's main showcase and is strictly reserved for the most loyal elites. On the other hand, the elites are also the main supporters of the regime because they know that if the regime falls, their privileges will disappear too. Ultimately, Songbun is a profoundly discriminatory system. This is a system that not only directly contradicts the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also fails to align with the fundamental claim of a classless communist society. The regime has fundamentally redefined ideology in such a way that it results in systematically categorizing people into first-class citizens, and those who may even be stripped of their most basic needs. Now, let's move on to explore India, a nation with a completely unique social system. The caste system in India is known as one of the oldest class systems in the world. It is a rigid structure that, despite being officially banned by the Constitution in 1950, still survives informally and socially. the law changed, but the traditional mindset did not shift so easily. In its simplest form, the traditional caste structure has four main classes. 1. Brahmins, which include priests and spiritual leaders. 2. Kshatriyas, which include warriors, traditional rulers, and those who held military and political power. 3. Vaishyas, which include merchants and tradespeople. 4th, the Shudras, which include manual laborers and servants. But the reality is much more complicated. Across India, there are between 20 to 30,000 subcastes or jatis. These are groups that are usually identified by a hereditary occupation, that is, a job that was expected to be passed down through generations. Caste is not merely defined by one's occupation. The caste you are born into fundamentally dictates your social status, your social interactions, dietary restrictions, and even your choice of a marriage partner. Marrying someone from a different caste has traditionally been a strictly forbidden boundary, and in numerous regions across the country, it still faces intense family pressure, or even the threat of violence and social ostracism for both parties involved. The roots of this system go back to the Vedic texts and the structures of ancient India. These are structures that took shape over centuries and later became even more entrenched with the emergence of Hinduism and its myths. Throughout different periods, from the spread of Buddhism to the arrival of Alexander and later the Islamic dynasties and British colonialism, this system was weakened, but it never completely disappeared. In the 19th century, British colonialism, by officially registering castes and administratively categorizing people, effectively made this structure more rigid and gave it a bureaucratic form. In other words, it gave these structures an administrative order and organization, and used them as a political and ideological toolbox to control society. After India's independence in 1947 under Gandhi's leadership and the drafting of the Constitution in 1950, caste discrimination and untouchability were officially banned. However, deeply rooted beliefs such as karma and reincarnation, and the idea that each person's current position is the result of their actions in a previous life, led many to see this inequality as natural or even justified. Even today, in numerous regions, you can identify which caste a person belongs to based on their last name, place of residence, or even the specific way they speak. Throughout history, the higher castes had greater access to education, nutrition, and resources, and this economic gap has persisted to this day, so that a large portion of the wealthy come from the higher castes, while a significant number of the poor are from the lower castes. In the caste tradition, dietary rules have also been a sign of status. Many Brahmins were considered vegetarians and viewed the consumption of meat or alcohol as impure and forbidden. In stark contrast, tasks associated with ritual impurity, such as contact with corpses or human waste, were relegated to the lowest groups. Of course, these rules differed significantly depending on the region and specific local cultural traditions. And this is where we come to the Dalits, a group that was outside the main caste hierarchy and was historically known as the untouchables. Tasks such as collecting garbage, handling corpses, or cleaning sewage were assigned to them. And since, in traditional logic, contact with certain human materials like corpses was considered ritually impure, this led to their social exclusion. Let me also mention that in traditional Indian culture, ritual impurity is different from physical dirtiness. For example, garbage or a dead animal might be dirty, but it may not be considered ritually impure. But things like contact with a corpse are considered ritually impure. In fact, ritual impurity means that something might appear clean on the surface, but according to religious law, it is considered impure. Even though the Constitution guarantees equal rights, discrimination against Dalits is still frequently seen in some rural and deprived areas. In certain places where local social customs are much stronger than the law, One of the most shocking manifestations of this discrimination in the past was the segregation of water sources. Within various rural villages, Dalits were strictly prohibited from using wells that were owned by the upper castes. Crossing this established boundary could frequently lead to humiliation, violence, or even murder. Today, these behaviors are strictly prohibited by law, but in some areas they are still occasionally reported to the authorities. In recent years, the Indian government has successfully established and implemented a comprehensive quota system in education, parliament, and government jobs to compensate for historical discrimination. Nevertheless, as long as the class-based mindset does not completely disappear, millions of people will continue to feel the effects of a system that has lasted for thousands of years in their daily lives. And finally, we come to China, with a system that is the strangest of them all. For several decades, the hukou system was one of the most fundamental pillars of organizing China's economy. The hukou system has historically played a crucial role in how the Chinese government managed and controlled its people. For many years, this system functioned much like an internal passport, effectively drawing an invisible yet rigid border between the cities and the rural countryside. In fact, the hukou system was designed so that cities could grow, but by extracting resources from rural areas. In much simpler terms, it meant the systematic exploitation of rural resources and rural labor. The reason for this was clear. Unlike many European powers, China was unable to grow its economy by colonizing distant countries across the globe. For instance, it could not replicate what Britain did in India. The hukou system was first established in the 1950s and gradually expanded. Then, in the year 1958, exactly at the same time as the start of the Great Leap Forward, it reached its most complete and strictest possible form. Of course, the roots of this system are much older. For centuries, China has had various forms of household registration and population control in its plans. On the other hand, the design of the hukou system was also heavily influenced by the propiska system in the Soviet Union. This was a system that strictly limited the number of people allowed to live in urban cities. But how exactly did the hukou system actually work? Essentially, the hukou was a mandatory permit that every individual was required to have, specifying exactly where they lived and where they worked. The main function of this system was to ultimately divide the entire population into two categories: urban non-agricultural or rural agricultural settings. Based on this classification, each person was then assigned to a workplace. In the countryside, it was usually a large collective farm, and in the city, a factory or a government office. Whether a person's hukou was urban or rural had a profound and decisive impact on their life. In practical everyday terms, it effectively determined whether you were a winner or a loser. Now, why is that? Because the public goods and services provided by the government were entirely dependent on the type of hukou you had. Those living in cities received a much larger share. Housing, education for children, healthcare services, and better rations. But for people living in rural areas, the government did not directly provide these services. Instead, the responsibility fell on collective farms or smaller production groups. In such a system, the agricultural workforce was easily controlled, and the government could purchase grain from the farms at very low prices and transport it to the cities to feed the industrial workforce. Only enough was left for the farmers themselves to survive. And that was only if the system functioned without any disruptions. By extracting grain from the villages at low cost, the government could maintain a higher standard of living in the cities and push industrialization forward at the fastest possible pace. And this was the main goal they sought. Furthermore, the farmers were prohibited from migrating freely to the cities because the restrictive hukou system chained them to their rural workplaces like slaves. But why exactly did Chinese policymakers decide to implement such a complex system? First, they were faced with the task of building China's national economy and industrial base. Under conditions of intense international hostility, coming especially from the United States at the time. The United States did not expect the communists to win the Civil War, and after their victory, it very quickly tried to put pressure on the new government. This was done through trade sanctions and establishing military bases around China as part of a containment policy. This environment made development through global free trade very risky, and the Communist Party did not want to gamble the country's future on that path. Secondly, China did not have the option to industrialize through foreign colonization, neither in terms of international circumstances nor in terms of the Communist Party's anti-colonial and anti-imperialist ideology. The Communist Party. Third, the party leaders came to power with the promise of saving China from the domination of global capitalism, a system that, in their view, kept the country in a dependent and backward state. So perhaps this is the main paradox. When there was no foreign option, the Communist Party decided to pursue development from within, even if that meant a kind of internal exploitation. It's truly bitter and heartbreaking, because we think slavery and social discrimination are things of the distant past. But these systems show that the chains have only become deeply invisible. I want to know, how did you feel when you heard these stories? Write your thoughts for me down below in the comments. Honestly, in the 21st century, maybe we believe that freedom and justice exist. But the triangular axis of North Korea, India, and China clearly shows that millions of people still live in invisible cages. Social classes, systemic restrictions, and predetermined destinies may have evolved in their outward appearance, but their effects still remain today. They continue to shape the lives of millions of people. The most important lesson is that true social justice only comes about when we recognize and reform the systems that restrict people from birth.